And welcome to week 3 of the TriNetX Summer Bootcamp for 2026. This week is about comparing cohorts and propensity score matching, which is a crucial component in ensuring that uh, our cohorts are balanced, that we don't have lots of random factors or random noise disrupting our analysis or causing us to have erroneous findings. And we're going to talk a little bit about what propensity score matching is and what those three words mean when we put them together. Um, but yeah, as always, I'm Dr. Daniel Novak, Director of Student Scholarly Activities here in the School of Medicine. I've got a whole thing. This is my whole career, kind of condensed down into one slide. It's like 20 years of work. I don't have any formal funding or support from TriNetX. I work with some of their folks there sometimes um, because they, support our we get support from their technology and account folks, but we don't have any kind of financial relationship or anything like that. I don't own any shares in their work in their software or anything. However, some of my salary time for this boot camp was paid for originally with funds from an NIH U54 grant held by City of Hope. I'm not getting paid anything extra out of that, just doing this as part of my work and my regular job. And the U54 funds are part of that support as well. And we report on this boot camp to them. Um, our boot camp, the boot camp weekly overview, we finished week 1 and 2. Those videos are on YouTube if you would like to go see them. Um, And we are in the middle of week 3. We're kind of getting to the top of the hump here and to some of the most interesting parts in here as well. Again, your bootcamp objectives, you're going to learn to navigate the interface, identify worthwhile projects, compare outcomes between patient cohorts, and today use propensity score matching to reduce confounders. Let's just take a step back and look at where we are. We build in my clunky metaphor, if you've been following along, in building our house, our study. We've laid our foundation from part 1, where we've had our project and team management. We've talked about developing cohorts and how that works, and now we're into building the house itself. So in week 3, we're going to talk about choosing an analysis tool. We're going to talk about index events again and really get into that as a concept. We're going to talk about cohort comparisons and baselines and balancing cohorts, and finally propensity score matching. Today should be a little shorter, I hope, than usual. If you're following along doing the rapid development process, you will already have reviewed your literature to identify questions that are of value, both clinically and empirically. You're going to you've already learned about building your cohorts, and now we are talking about comparing cohorts and propensity score matching today. In the even more rapid process, you've already pulled out key features from an article that you might have read. You're reconstructing that study in TriNetX, and you're refocusing the structure on your topic. And you're going to start to, this week, compare the outcomes. And next week, we're going to look at actually running your analysis and what that will look like. So this week is kind of the penultimate component. Week 4 is really the most exciting, I suppose. Again, my clunky metaphor, the foundation of your project supports the validity of your findings. Having solid inclusion exclusion criteria, time and order events, and frequency of events, being really crystal clear on those before you start really just running numbers randomly, willy-nilly. Cohort exploration for confounders, looking for possible alternative explanations within the composition of your cohort that might undermine the validity of your study. Building the house on top of that is really not going to be productive. We're also going to talk about today outcomes. Next week, we're really going to talk about outcomes and what that looks like and how to think about outcomes in your study. But your house is where your discoveries live, choosing the right analysis type, understanding cause and effect, order, and propensity score matching will be the core components of that house and supporting those outcomes. So looking back at my example summary, if you've been following along, you might remember that I've been talking about this guy and his clowny behavior, talking about how Alzheimer's is a patient-created disease and how I don't agree with that, and how we developed some hypotheses to test based on that that faulty premise that this person has that statins is associated with higher likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease. So last week we defined our cohorts using advanced cohort features and the explore cohort function. Now we're going to move on to, as I said, the analysis phase and start getting into that. So we're going to first we're going to start out by talking about choosing an analysis tool. So our cohorts are done, right? You have really thought through how to identify the core people in your study. And here you can see we've done some stuff, right? We're on the US collaborative network, so we've selected the correct network. We've picked patients over the age of 45 because there's no reason to include people under 45. They very, very rarely have the outcome that we're interested in, so they would just be statistical noise. If we included anybody over the age of 18 years old, well, that's not really very helpful if we're looking at Alzheimer's because the average age of the development of Alzheimer's is in the late 50s, mid 60s, right? So, being over the age of 45 will ideally allow us to catch any early onset diabetes that are not related to one of our exclusion criteria, which is Down syndrome, but would allow us to collect people who maybe start to experience symptoms and get diagnosed earlier because we don't really know if that's something that could impact it. But we definitely know that anybody under 45, something else might be going on that would lead them to develop Alzheimer's that young, that may be beyond the bounds of our study. You can see here we have a whole range of exclusion criteria. You can consult our paper if you'd like to see how we finally set that up. You can find it on in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. Uh, if you want a worked example here for how we did this, I tried to include as much information and as being as open with our cohort definition as I possibly could, so that anybody reading our paper could rerun this study in 5 years. And we also published it thanks to the University of California's generous program through the library. We're able to publish this open access. So anybody in the world, regardless of whether you're at academic medical center or an HCO that maybe doesn't have access to Sage journals, you should be able to download and read this article if you go to this DOI number that I'm highlighting on the screen right now. Rather than show you in TriNetX and take you back through the cohort construction, you can just see here we were looking for anybody with disorders of lipoprotein metabolism, which is E78. It's a very, very broad category of people. 19 million people are diagnosed with that. And the other group would go on to be prescribed a statin after that, at some point after that. We also excluded anybody with any of these types of conditions. We went through rigorous vetting with experts about what characteristics we should include and exclude, what characteristics might be confounders potentially for our study, right? And so we even actually talking to after getting feedback from the reviewers, we wound up running this multiple ways where and you'll see we detailed this in a sensitivity analysis description in our study. They asked us, well, what about type 2 diabetes? You kicked out everybody with type 2 diabetes in your initial analysis, but type 2 diabetes might be one of the reasons that the person's on the statin, because that can be not only it can cause disorders of lipoprotein metabolism, right? So fat dysregularities, right, and things like that based on type 2 diabetes, and it's just very comorbid with it. So rather than reject their whole idea, we reran the analysis with type 2 diabetes included, and also with it as a propensity score matching characteristic, and also with it excluded. And whenever we did it, however we did it, we came up with roughly the same answer each time. So that's something we're going to talk about today is also trying to use multiple means to falsify your own hypothesis before you start to try to think about writing this up as a paper. There is a big problem out there in the broader research with especially medical students, but also poorly trained physicians putting out papers that would not stand up to deep statistical scrutiny. And somehow they make it through peer review But especially in specialty journals, they may not have the necessary expertise to critique these kinds of big data studies or real world data studies. One thing we're going to talk about is it's up to you to try to falsify your analysis, try to find ways to break your findings. And there's a number of folks in the TriNetX research community who support this, who think that that's actually the best way to get to good quality studies. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today and the concept of a couple of different ways of doing that. And next week we'll talk more about specific approaches for knowing if we have successfully identified something of interest. Um, but okay, our cohorts are done, and now we're going to move on to this tab over here in the TriNetX interface that you'll see as analytics. Now, TriNetX has made some changes to their interface that you may see on here. I've turned mine off. You can see where it says enable AI navigation. So you may be looking at this instead. And so advanced analytics is going to be what you're looking for if you are in this version of their interface. And you'll see it'll bring up all of the analysis tools that we're going to talk about. And you can click the button for new analysis to start developing those analysis. So let's talk about these really quick. What are the analytics tools? When you hit that new analysis button, whether your view looks like this or looks like the AI view, what happens when we press that? Well, you're given 8 standard tools that are available to folks. And the most common one used is the compare outcomes tool, because fundamentally in medicine, that's really what we're most interested in. However, there are other tools you might find useful. In session 5, we're going to talk about treatment pathways, which I used in our statins and Alzheimer's paper to look at whether people were switching around between different medications frequently. It'll also give you information about how long people are on medications or how long between surgeries and things like that. And you can also use the Cox proportional hazards model on its as a standalone tool, and we'll talk about that as well. So keep an eye out on this. TriNetX does periodically release new ones. They released the Cox proportional hazards model standalone tool last year, and it's been very useful for a number of different kinds of studies that we've done. Um, there's really no best tool, though. It depends on having a clear and focused research question, right? Is your question about time, order, or sequence? Is your question about specific outcomes and who in a cohort experiences those outcomes? Is your question about relative risks? Any of those might lead you to choose different tools in that pool. And this is a brief summary, just based on what TriNetX kind of posts in there with the analyzed cohort, and you can kind of see which one of these best fits your needs. I don't actually use incidence and prevalence a lot because it's doesn't really always help in answering our questions about incidence and prevalence. So I tend to use other tools to help make that assessment. But specifically compare outcomes, compare cohorts. Those can be very valuable as we go away. So cohort comparison is going to be the focus for our week. We're going to use the two cohort compare outcomes function. Um, and it includes the comparisons between two cohorts on what happens to them. That's the compare outcomes part. But it also includes the same exact tools that you'd find in the compare cohorts tool and in the competing risks tool. So you can really use this one to do all 3 of those things as you're doing your analysis. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, so how do you load up your cohort? So these are the great tools on your left that you're going to use. And we're going to go through each of these menus to give you a sense of how this all fits together into an analysis process. So you can see here, these little starred cohorts are my statins and Alzheimer's, with one group having the no statin and one group having the statin. So I actually tend to put my experimental group, in this case, I would have put my statins group in cohort 1, because then you get to see how much your group of interest, whether their risk is increased or decreased relative to your control group. So you can see here we have them all defined out and loaded up. And we're going to talk about index events really quickly. Again, we talked about it a little bit last week because it's an important concept, but we're going to really dive into this for a second. So an index event can be roughly defined as the day that someone enters your study. It's the day that the characteristics that you choose to identify as being salient to your study for the purposes of selecting someone for to follow them through their life course and their health course, what day that is, that all the events that have come true that you want to use. Now, in TriNetX, you don't have to choose everything that defines your cohort does not have to be selected as an index event. This is an opportunity for you to get some control over when people enter your study. So you can specify, for example, that people in your cohort had never had a disease prior to their diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, just as an example, but that doesn't have to be the index event. You could define your index event instead as never having had that disease, but they don't enter your study until they have had type 2 diabetes and been put on a GLP-1. You could also choose to include people who had been on metformin, but that might not be part of your index event, right? In that case, people would enter into your study before that. We'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. And we can even look back if it's still, it can be a little bit of a confusing concept. But if there's one thing that I would recommend investing some time in, it's understanding how index events work. So this is the day someone enters your study, and we're going to look in a moment in the TriNetX interface at a page called characteristics. And this is looking back at the past. Again, I'm going to use this analogy of Back to the Future. This is our DeLorean, our time machine, going back into the person's record, and we can change how far back we look. We can look 1 year, 1 day, 1 year, 1 month, however far back into the person's record we want to look, and that can be really important. So, for example, um, if you want to see if a person had ever had pneumonia in their whole life, well, you might want to look all the way back into their health record. But for the purposes of your study, it may not have mattered if they had pneumonia when they were in their teens or as a child. You might only care about whether they developed pneumonia later on in their health record, right? And that would mean that you can bracket, and we'll talk about how you do that, bracket your look back period in the characteristics. Then we have your outcomes, which is looking towards the future. And we're going to show you where that is in just a moment. Um, this is where I was talking about a moment ago. This is your time machine looking backwards into the past, right? This is on, as I was describing a moment ago, the characteristics page. And this dragger allows you to specify how far back into the past you look. Now, in this case, as I mentioned, we're looking all the way into the past, as far back as we can go, to identify whether this person has had any of these features in their health record ever in their life. But again, you could bracket it and say, we only want to see whether they've had this infection or this medication or whatever your index event is in the last 5 years. And then it will select only those, it'll bracket all the rest of these dialogues I'm going to show you in a moment to those last 5 years. So again, let's dive back into this concept. We're going to look into the past, but relevant to what? So TriNetX says to define an index event for each cohort, select one or more criteria for each cohort. The index day for each patient within a cohort is the day on which the patient first meets all selected criteria for the cohort. So you can see, as I was saying earlier, cohort characteristics are in the past, prior to the index event, and the outcomes are in the future, after the index event. So again, simply an index event is the first day at which all of the features you've included in your cohort definition are true. First day that they had high blood pressure and received their medication, right? Versus our index event for our study, I believe, was the first day that they were diagnosed with disorders of lipoprotein metabolism, but not necessarily the first day that they received their medication, because there could be years between those for all we know. And that creates something we're going to talk about later called the immortal time bias, where you have people entering your study and hanging around for years without being able to be kicked out, but they could just be aging and getting older and sicker while they're immortal and not being able to be kicked out of your study until they enter in when they've been prescribed their medication, versus the other group of people who could have been in your study for even longer, for all we know. So it gets very complicated, but understanding and controlling the relationship of your index event criteria really helps to make sure that you're seeing what you think you're seeing in your outcome. TriNetX has a really great analysis version that you can look example that you can look at on their site in their help files. I'm going to call that up really quick, actually, just so we can take a look at it, because the way they have it visualized is very helpful in understanding what's going on with an index event. So, one second. Come on. Oh, all right. Since they might have moved or restructured their stuff, I am going to quickly go to their help center. If you go to their help center and type in index event, um, you'll get some of these exact same things I was talking about earlier. But this is really helpful. Okay, so this is a patient timeline. Really quickly, I want to walk you through what this is all talking about. Um, we're looking at four patients here, and the days on which, over the course of a couple of years, that they experienced different um, combinations of medications and symptoms. So you can see this person first enters their health record with asthma, but this person first enters with sneezing, and this person doesn't have anything, but then they show up and have asthma. So this one was showed up with asthma in April, was given albuterol. This person showed up in January, got nothing, then they were diagnosed with asthma later, and then they have albuterol in July. So you can see that there's several months between these two same patients getting albuterol. Meanwhile, this person, their health could just be getting worse and worse. So this person goes on albuterol for a couple months. In October, they show up and they get montelukast, which is another medication, a more stronger medication, and they still continue developing symptoms beyond that. Meanwhile, this person down here, I'm just jumping around a little bit to give you a little bit of sense of what's going on. They have a different disease and medication pathway. So, depending on how you set up your index event, in this case, we're going to start the index event whenever a person is diagnosed with asthma. You can see that people enter the study at wildly different places. This person showed up sneezing, wheezing, and coughing before they were finally diagnosed with asthma. So they've been almost a whole year they could have been almost a whole year in your study before they are finally entered as part of their index event on January 17th. Meanwhile, these two people on January 16th enter your study before they start developing and some of these other conditions and before they're medicated. So um, you can see that depending on the kinds of um, characteristics that you select, you can wind up with very different um, entry and exit periods, very different times. So if cough and wheezing are your characteristics, you're going to start getting people where they have to have had a cough, a wheezing, and a cough in their record before they enter in. So that's April 17th for this person, January 17th for this person. And these people were both diagnosed with wheezing on July 16th and cough on October 16th. So there's quite a bit of diversity in when these people are entering. And just imagine instead of being like a month or two or 3 or 4 months here, that we're talking years of difference. That could really impact where you're seeing them in their disease progression. Same with sneezing, right? Now some of these people have had asthma for years and years, right? Or for in this case, at least a year before any of them are diagnosed with sneezing, right? So that could severely change how we see them in their health record. So I recommend, I'm going to put this in the chat, but I recommend reading this page carefully to truly get a strong understanding of how index events can impact your inclusion, your analysis more deeply. Um, so somebody is asking in the chat, can you clarify if this is just a more specific filter than the relative time constraints in the group? Yes, this can the time constraints in the groups, if you remember from the last video, allow you to set when chronologically in time relationships occur in your group. This um, impacts where they enter your analysis. So, in order to become part of your cohort, somebody has to meet those time characteristics in that you define, whether it's chronological, like in 2020, right, based on an actual chronological time point, or if it was a factor that was defined um, uh, uh, based on two relationships. Like, for example, being diagnosed with asthma, then being diagnosed with or being given montelukast, right? This um, then indicates which part of that becomes the starting point for your analysis. So the filters, the time filters, the group relationships that we talked about last time are necessary to get people into your cohort. But once you have that cohort of people, index events are necessary to define when those people start in your study. And that can have big consequences, as I noted. So let's look at the characteristics function in here. So the compare cohort characteristics, you'll see this if you look at your TriNetX study, however you may be accessing the interface now. Um, Let me just find one really quick, an existing analysis. Um, and we're going to look for, I'm actually going to switch over. This is how you disable AI navigation. I'm going to switch over to that. I'm going to look at characteristics. This is that screen I was showing you a moment ago. Um, in the live view, I find this a little easier to see. So what this will tell you, this screen where it says characteristics, remember doctors don't pay money late from our last discussion. Um, This tool, the compare cohort characteristics, helps you to see once you run, you hit this run button here to develop it. It uses that same doctors don't pay money late, your demographics, diagnoses, procedures, medications, labs, and other factors like genomics and cancer. You can see those here, right? Demographics, diagnoses, procedures, medications, and labs. Just the same as in our explore cohort function that we talked about earlier. However, this will give you your general comparisons between two groups. So what this tells you, remember that purple is cohort one and green is cohort two. What this tells us is that our cohort one at index, the way we set this up, in this case, our no statin group is on average 55.3 years old, plus or minus 13.8, which is the standard deviation. So you go one standard deviation out, and you're talking on either side, people between the ages of 68 and 42, give or take. Um, and our group over here, our statins group is about 65.7. So on average, about 10 years older than the other group. So that's good to know. That means that that age difference itself could be a confounding factor for our study, right? So, and then we also see over here that even though it's slight, there are slightly more women in the no statin cohort than in the statins cohort, and slightly more men in the statins cohort, conversely, than in the no statins cohort. Please be aware, though, that unknown does not mean transgender or non-binary or any of the more complex dimensions. It may just mean that the person didn't check a box on the form, or that HCO did not have a form for it. And you can see it's a relatively small pool of people, so we can't assume that it means that there's a sociocultural definition of gender at work in this definition. You also see this with ethnicities that say not Hispanic or Latino or unknown ethnicity. That is not a characteristic that I would recommend matching on, because it's just anybody who is not Latino. It includes white folks and black folks and Asian folks and anybody else. So do not use these non-characteristics, unknown ethnicity, not Hispanic or Latino or unknown, when you're doing your propensity score matching, please. I often have to correct this with students. I also recommend being very cautious about using current age. I don't recommend matching on it, because generally, for our purposes in these studies, we don't care what their current real life age is. We care how old they were when they started our study, right? And that's kind of what I would recommend propensity score matching for here, because they could have any number of things could have happened during their between then and now, right? I recommend not propensity score matching by current age for the most part. So you'll notice, though, when you are able to see some of these characteristics, in this, whether it's demographics or any of these factors, there is an icon with a star next to it. And that allows you to save the characteristic for your propensity score matching model. And it'll enter that in. You'll see that each one of these stars, every time you add one, adds one over here to this saved characteristics. And if we click over here, you'll see all of those characteristics that I had starred in the demographics right there. Age index, male, female, Hispanic or Latino, white, black, or in this case, I want to uncheck current age. And you'll see that that'll reduce the number down to 8 and uncheck it from the other screen. This is very important because, as I'll talk about in a moment, these stars are the way that you identify factors that you want TriNetX to add to your propensity score model. Don't we'll talk about how that can be confusing in a moment in another screen. But let's talk about strategies. And let's go over here to the diagnoses phase. So under diagnoses, procedures, medications, and labs, you're going to see not only the ICD-10 hierarchy here, right? So here's endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases. As we talked about last time, things you've added to your cohort are already going to be marked in blue here. So we didn't include metabolic disorders, right? We included uh, other factors like, in this case, I included type 2 diabetes in this version. So you'll see 100% of both cohorts have type 2 diabetes in it because that's part of our index event. But you'll see that some cohorts maybe have different factors underneath that are at different rates, and you'll see. So, but however, given the sizes of these cohorts, um, there can be really wow. Oh, actually, this is a whole other study that I was helping someone with. There can be wild differences in representation of different factors. So, 74% of cohort one in this pool is has been coded with overweight, obesity, or other hyperalimentation, right? Versus 46% of the cohort. Now, TriNetX helpfully gives us this little signal icon, which is a lot like a cell phone icon, right? 1, 2, 3 bars to help us statistically assess. They actually tell you in their help documentation how this is calculated, but it's a tool that helps us assess, like, okay, there's a 12% difference between these two groups and a 30 whatever percent difference, but a 20% difference between these two groups. Is that meaningful, right? When we weight this between the two groups. And if there's 2 bars, you might consider and say, you know what? I am concerned that um, the difference in overweight and obesity, representation of overweight and obesity between these two groups might skew my findings, right? Because people with overweight and obesity may have higher rates of uh, uh, illness of different types that are relevant to my analysis. So then you star that, and that will add it to your saved characteristics over here. So you can use the signal icon. But most importantly, I want to emphasize this. And I'll probably talk about this again in a moment, but I want to emphasize that when you are selecting these characteristics for your propensity score matching, use your brain. You must think about theoretically using your knowledge and any tools you have, AI, readings, whatever you can find to assess whether these factors are relevant to your study. Do not simply say, well, I added it just because, there's the TriNetX interface told me to. Don't do that. TriNetX can't tell you whether overweight and obesity is relevant to your findings or not. You, as the study developer, as the creator of this study, must be in control of your use of this tool and how these factors relate. In fact, there's a whole thing I teach about in my class called DAGs that help you to identify and relate these factors to your hypothesis and to your question. And using an approach like that can help you be crystal clear about why, whether it's for disease pathway reasons or other factors, this factor might be impacting your study. So starring these icons to add them to your propensity score model will help you reduce the bias caused by having one group that is just much heavier and has greater rates of obesity than the other group. The other thing I want to note, though, because I see this a lot from students, is people will I don't mean this in a rude way, but kind of mindlessly go through and check all of these top level things. They'll go, oh, okay, hey, look, I got to include this, I got to include this, and I got to include this. Oh, and look at this one, I got to include this one. I'm just going to include everything under the sun. The problem is if you check these top level codes like this, what TriNetX does is go through and select any of these lower order questions. So if you are selecting diseases of the nervous system, it might randomly grab pain, not classified elsewhere, or it might grab episodic and paroxysmal disorders up at this top level here, or it might go pick something lower, like Alzheimer's disease is located in one of these as well. So it might pick patients with that. So you want to make sure you drill down to a level where you're going to be able to identify the most, you kind of have to use a judgment call again to identify the most relevant sets of codes within that hierarchy, within that structure. Um, and there's no one set of rules for doing this. You're going to have to theoretically understand it and justify it in your analysis. We're going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, so it's okay to be a little confused. Um, but broadly, you should save a cohort characteristic when the characteristic is plausibly relevant to differences in outcomes in your cohort. That is, if people who have been diagnosed as overweight or obese, if having a greater percentage of those people in one cohort or the other might skew your outcomes by overrepresenting certain people with characteristics that are more likely to have your outcomes, all you're going to find is that people who've been diagnosed with overweight and obesity are more likely to have illnesses. And we know that through lots of documentation. That's not really contributing to the understanding, may not necessarily be contributing to the deeper understanding of the relationship that your hypothesis is asking. So you should also say the characteristic when it has a strong signal or a large proportional disparity. However, we will talk about in a moment a couple of different times when that's actually not relevant. In fact, I might as well talk about it now. You'll see over here, I don't have an example on screen right now, but sometimes when you have really small percentages of a cohort like this, it can register as having 3 bars because it can seem, when statistically weighted, that it's actually quite a large difference, even if it's not, right? It might be one group might have 0 people and the other group might have 12 people, and that would register as a 3 in a 3 bar situation. So I don't see any immediately in this worked example, but if you see that, you just have to be really skeptical about whether that's actually going to be relevant. You'll have to be aware of whether that's a meaningful difference between those groups. But generally, having a strong signal or large proportional disparity might indicate that that is a pre-existing characteristic of the group that you're interested in and not something that's necessarily relevant to your outcome. Also, you should save it when it's something that you want to control for in your analysis, but you don't necessarily want to exclude the whole population of people with that characteristic because it might go along part and parcel with your analysis. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Um, so you're going to go through, you're going to do your doctors don't pay money late, right? You're going to check out as you're doing your analysis, you're going to go through your diagnoses and you're going to go through your procedures. Um, Now, you're going to see here that there might be slight differences in surgery between different groups or between services and procedures. You really have to think about whether, if the person's had a shunt or something like that, or they've had the Watchman procedure or anything like that, if that's going to be relevant to your study or not. Don't just randomly pick all of these things or pick the top level one just in case. You really want to understand what the relationship is between that procedure and this group that you're trying to analyze these two groups. Um, Same with medications. I just want to show you really quickly that it has the hierarchy for all their medications. So you can look and see, is there one group that's on, a hormone like insulin at higher rates than the other group? You might really want to consider that. And then also labs. This is where you're going to find really important ones like A1C that you may want to control for. You can see all the baseline labs as well. You can see here, generally, they're pretty similar for these folks. There are a couple of places where they're a little different. And you can see over here that the signal icon is also kind of helping us understand that. Oh, but look, this group has much higher baseline triglycerides. That might be a problem. And we can look at this. It'll actually give us a little graph here showing us where those differences are occurring here. So our purple group generally has higher percentages of the cohort landing in some of these higher areas. So, that might really impact whether we want to include this in our analysis, depending on what we're doing. Let me just show you an example of what happens when we select a lab in a moment. I'm going to go down to A1C, and you can see I've included A1C here as a factor. We can see that overall, they're both very high because obviously we're picking people with type 2 diabetes, but the purple group has slightly higher, the GLP-1 group has slightly higher um, A1C values, then they're at 7 versus the other group at 6.71. Not that surprising since if they're on a GLP-1, they probably have pretty high A1C going in here. You can see some of the other ones. Down here is another favorite, BMI, which is very useful here. There's a couple of other ways to represent BMI in your study that are important to be aware of. There are also codes, diagnostic codes for BMI that you might want a propensity score match for. We find that across health systems, some use the ICD-10 diagnostic codes here for BMI, and some use lab values. So if you really, really want to have safety on your side, you can select both in there. So if you type in BMI, it's a Z code in there. You can also include, as we talked about a moment ago, overweight, obesity, and hyperalimentation may be another. That's more of a diagnosis. You might actually, this is worth talking about for a moment. Just that when you're talking about BMI specifically, um, when you are um, conducting your analysis, you may want to include both the Z code, the lab value, and a diagnosis of overweight or obesity. And the reason is that different systems use different combinations of those things to identify whether a person is in the obese category or not. So that's just something to be aware of as you're developing this. Um, so, demographics, diagnoses, procedures, medications, and labs. Doctors don't pay money late. Um, but now what happens once we've done this? Well, we can use this tool to run a baseline characteristic analysis. I'm going to run this and then show you the slide here. When you go down to this icon, this section, baseline comparison statistics, and hit run, it's going to do a nice simple t-test for you, just to let you know whether there's any difference between the two groups. Now, for some folks, that analysis may be enough for their study, depending on what you're doing. You just want to know, is there a difference between the two groups? It's actually not a t-test, it's a z-test, which is at least theoretically more robust against population scale numbers than a t-test. It's less liable for distortion at very large values, like in the millions and stuff like that. So you'll see it'll report to you right here after you hit run your p-value, the standard difference, the number of patients in each group, and the percentage of the cohort that it's looking at. So that is not propensity score matched. It is merely a statement of whether there are more people with this value in one group than the other. So, always be aware of how you're using these numbers and what they actually tell you. This hasn't been controlled for anything. It's just a raw comparison of cohort 1 versus cohort 2. But that gets us to the question of why then do we need to do propensity score matching and all this other stuff that I've been talking about so much? Well, let's talk about what propensity score matching is first. There's one book from the stats book that I recommended in the previous two lectures. They believe that propensity score matching is a fad, but I really don't see it that way now. I mean, that book is now several years old, so propensity score matching continues to be a statistical methodology that's applied. They're improving it all the time. They're statisticians, people who study the borders of statistical methods, are continuously improving models for it, and they have other kinds of ways of defining it. But let's talk about what is propensity score matching. So technically, propensity score matching is a quasi-experimental method in which the researcher uses statistical techniques to construct an artificial control group by matching each treated unit, each group in our experimental condition, with a non-treated, a control unit of similar characteristics. And using these matches, the researcher can estimate the impact of an intervention. So, what that really translates to is the way that randomization helps us to reduce and control bias in a randomized controlled trial. That's the function of randomization, right? Is to make sure that it's not some property of the individual in a group or property of that group's individuals as a whole, that their random assignment to one condition or another in an experiment is helps to reduce that bias, right? It's a very strong way to do it that's been studied for generations. Propensity score matching is a way to do this in observational studies by um, pulling people from your control group and from your group, your experimental group, making sure that statistically they're along the characteristics that you define, they are just randomly different from each other as well. One group is one person's within one category, another person's within another category, and they're added to this group until everybody is kind of mushed around. That there is no, we're going to take this word by word, that their propensity for being in one group or another is not greater than in either group, right? So you don't have a person because of their BMI being more likely to be in group one or group two than another person. This is derived from a score that is created statistically using the characteristics that you assemble in your study, and those people are matched from each group. So propensity, are they likely? A propensity score is a value generated based on those characteristics about whether that person belongs in one group or another. And matching is the process of adding people from each group until we have statistical uh, randomness along those characteristics. So my apologies for explaining that saying that like five different times, but my goal is, because it's kind of an unwieldy concept, an unwieldy name, that you'll maybe one of those ways of saying it will have stuck with you. How does propensity score matching work? Well, first, as I said earlier, you select your set of covariates by starring them in TriNetX, right? Those are the baseline characteristics. Next, the TriNetX will use a statistical package to derive that score, right? About whether they're likely to be, in this case, your pink exposed group or your blue unexposed group. And then it's going to go through and pick, okay, you got in your unexposed and exposed group, you're going to have some stars that look like this and some stars that look like this and look like this. And it's going to try and match those people together until it runs out of matches, right? And then you get down here and these two guys don't match, right? They're small, weird, this one's starfish shaped and this one's more like cartoon Mario Kart star, and they don't match each other. So it stops, it doesn't include them in your study pool. There's a couple of issues. You can have model overfit in propensity score matching, meaning that if you select too many characteristics that are wacky, you can wind up accidentally loading the dice in one way or the other in favor or against your analysis, because you've selected people, you've told the model to select people that are um, uh, ultimately become non-random. They're more likely for one reason or another, whether it's theoretical, practical, clinical, whatever, to be in one group or the other. And plus, you can also wind up with situations where you have either such a small pool of people or such an unusual pool of people or something that they just can't be matched. And you wind up with very low match rates. That can be very hard. One thing you should be aware of in TriNetX is that it is a one-to-one matching, meaning that it'll pull from whichever your smaller group is, it's going to pull that number of people from the larger group and compare them one-to-one as close as it can get. So, in sum, propensity score matching does not make your cohorts the same or reduce significant differences between the cohorts. It creates new sub-cohorts that are sampled to balance these factors and make them statistically not significant from each other, to avoid systematic differences between groups based on your mediators, the factors that you're in there. So I just want to revisit a couple of important concepts that are going to be valuable in deciding whether you should include a factor in your study as a propensity score component of your propensity score model. You're going to want to think about these things as confounders or mediators, right? So a confounder is a variable that precedes both the exposure and the outcome and creates spurious associations. So a confounder is basically something that, as part of your study, is obscuring, right? If you imagine you're looking through a magnifying glass, sorry, a microscope, trying to see the bacteria you're interested in, the confounder is something that's in your field of view blocking that. And you think you're looking at the bacteria, but you're actually looking at a fingerprint or something like that, right? That's on the lens. A mediator is a variable that's on that causal pathway, that it's between the factors that define your characteristics of your cohort and the outcome you're interested in. That mediator, um, between exposure and impact and outcome, um, can be really that important, but you should avoid adjusting or matching on mediators because it can block part of the causal effect. So when you see confounders, you want to exclude confounders from your cohorts altogether. With mediators, you want to think about whether you want to exclude them or figure out some other way to control for these mediating effects. Age is a very common, sex are very common mediators. Language is a very common mediator. So these factors can be very important in deciding that. You can also have effect modifiers, which is a variable where the exposure's effect differs across levels. So you can have different groups impacted differently by the effect modifiers. Again, just to revisit that issue, when should I propensity score match and when should I exclude? You should propensity score match when the factor is a confounder. It affects both the exposure and the outcome. If you can't exclude them, then use propensity score matching. When it balances groups on pre-treatment factors, that is, um, people who are on insulin before the study starts, before index, right? You might want to make sure that you don't have one group full of people on insulin and one group not, or one group full of people who are experiencing overweight or obesity and one group that's not. And that will preserve your generalizability and adjust, but doesn't alter the population. However, when you can exclude from the cohort when the factor is an effect, modifier, mediator, or source of other kinds of clinical heterogeneity. For example, they may be people who, for some reason or other, can't get access or are ineligible for certain kinds of care. You may want to kick those people out. Um, for example, yeah, if they've had cancer treatments, they may not be eligible for certain other kinds of clinical treatments later on, so they may not be relevant. One example would be excluding, if you're doing a study on pregnant women, you may want to exclude people who have had hysterectomies prior to the thing because they might otherwise find their way into your study because they had previously been pregnant, but going forward into your study, they've had a hysterectomy, so they're not really going to be able to contribute to your findings about pregnancy that you're looking at later on. So you might want to exclude those folks. You want to narrow the cohort to isolate clean comparisons, right? That's when you really want to exclude people who are going to add noise to your signal. Having a cohort of like 12 million people is not necessarily a good thing. You can wind up with, unless you exclude people carefully, you can wind up with a lot of noise in there that just creates confusion. It actually makes it harder to propensity score match things. The math gets astronomically complex, and TriNetX will prevent you from matching against certain sizes of cohorts. There's no, as I said in a previous lecture, no perfect, ideal, correct size for a cohort, but the larger they get, up to a certain point, it's good, but after a certain point, it's bad. So you don't want to necessarily be indiscriminate in your size of cohort. And excluding people from the cohort can improve internal validity, but may reduce generalizability, right? So it can improve the accuracy of your findings within the context of your study, but if you exclude everybody, like we did in our Alzheimer's and statin study, we have an enormous list of exclusion criteria because our goal was to find people who were otherwise healthy. Because all of these factors, though they are very comorbid with Alzheimer's disease, are themselves risks for all, they exacerbate the disease state. So we wanted to kick them out because what we really, really, really wanted to know and narrow in on is the relationship between statins and Alzheimer's to the degree that we can exclude any of these other factors. So similarly, that increased our internal validity, but maybe reduced the generalizability of our findings because, you know, there aren't that many people in the universe. Though actually, we found pretty substantial cohort sizes during our studies. We had 2 million people in our no statin group and 900,000, in our statin group, so that we didn't actually have nobody in here. We had quite robust sizes of people. Um, but yeah, you want to that's a balance always between internal validity. So if a variable distorts the association due to pre-existing differences, match it. If a variable defines a distinct clinical context or causal pathway, exclude it. Let's go back here. So TriNetX also includes for you a nice friendly. Sorry, let me get back to my study there. A nice friendly propensity score simulator, right? So um, a lot of folks get confused about how this interface is doing things. So let me just get back to, kick me back to the main screen. Let me see if I can go back to my study. Nope. Nope. All right. Let me see over here. Thank you for your patience. I've got like a million tabs open. See if I can jump back. Here we go. Okay. Um, So you'll see that it includes, in addition to this, we looked at this baseline comparison statistics tool, and I ran it a couple moments ago. You can see it gave us these nice p-values, but you can also get this nice little handy dandy propensity score matching simulator. So before you get ready to go explore your outcome or identify your outcomes for your study and start analyzing them and propensity score matching your outcomes, you can use this tool to check and see how well your model does and whether these factors are valuable or not. I just want to, so I want to highlight one thing here, which is when you use lab values for your propensity score matching, you have to come to this screen where it says balance cohorts and propensity score matching inputs. You have to come here to set up your categories. You can see here when you hit this set categories for the A1C lab values that say TriNetX curated like this, you'll find that in this case, I set up categories of 3.5 to 5.7, 5.8 to 6.5 are kind of pre-diabetic folks, and then our 6.5 to 10, which is our diabetic group. If you don't set up these categories, TriNetX will default from a categorical value, from using propensity score matching based on these categories to just whether the person has an A1C value or not in their in their record, which is not useful at all to you. Same with BMI, right? We don't care about whether the person has a BMI in their record. What we want is to make sure that our study does not have one of these characteristics that's overrepresented in there. So, to clarify what this does, these categories don't exclude anybody from your study. What it says is as it's matching one to one in your groups, it's going to try to make sure that there's no statistically significant difference between representation of people in this group and in this group and in this group between the two groups, between the two cohorts. And that can be really important because then, especially depending on the kind of study you're doing, you have a randomized group of people between your two cohorts. It's randomized whether they have whether people are in this whether they're in this category of blood sugar or this category or this category, and that can be really valuable in making sure that everything is correct. So when you have this, you can hit run and it'll run a little, as I said earlier, like a propensity score matching simulator for you. So let's talk about what it tells you, what TriNetX gives you back about your propensity score match in here. So let's start at the top in your propensity score matching results. You'll get the same outcome, same screens when you look at your results later, but let's look at it in this capacity. So you'll see that before matching, our no statin and no AD comorbidities cohort that we had 3 million people in it, right? And our statins, no comorbidities for 1 year, version 3 that I created, had 169,558 people in it. So what TriNetX is going to do is try to find 169,558 people in this pool of 3 million people to use as a comparator cohort. And it's going to use those characteristics that we identified to try to make sure that there is no statistical relationship between, or rather, there's no significant differences along the characteristics that we've identified between the two groups. So you can see here, these are the propensity scores on a scale of 0 to 1. What this means is over here, this graph, the x-axis is this is a perfectly random person, a person who is no more likely to be in group one than in group two, in cohort one than in cohort two. And this is a person over here on this end of the axis that is 100% likely to be in cohort one or cohort two. And you can see the two graphs show you. So what you can see is on average, um, most of the people, 30% of the people are kind of random in this pool, and like 15% of this pool are kind of random. But once we cross point one, which is kind of an important threshold that we'll talk about in a sec, um, there's a lot less randomness. That means that there are some differences between our group that are non-statistically random. That we don't just have that there's meaningful differences that we've identified in our model, and we're catching some of them. So before matching these groups, there's a lot of there's no not let's say very little overlap between their propensity scores and the percentages of the cohorts that were represented by those scores. And after matching, we have a pretty good overlap between those two groups that helps us to see that our model is looking pretty good. Let's dig into it though. TriNetX is going to give you below that. Actually, this should have run by now. Yeah, you can see here's this group that I just ran a moment ago, jumping back into the live system. You can see uh, the two groups. These groups are very different from each other along all the different metrics that we chose. And after matching, their distributions are a little more similar, but not great. But I want to show you a couple things. Underneath this graph, the graph is cool, but it's not actually that useful. What we really need to look at are these tables below. Let me take you through these tables in the PowerPoint really quickly. So, when you see it, you'll be able to turn on and off these values here that say p-value and standard difference. And I'll take you through what those mean, but turning these on and off is really important. I'd recommend turning them on right away so you can take a look at this carefully. But basically, TriNetX will give you a list of values before matching. So in order to evaluate whether your propensity score match is doing a good job, you need to take a look at how things were before the match. So before matching in this pool of people, as I said earlier, in this case, I guess there's about a 14-year difference in age between the two groups. You can see that the p-value in this case before matching is less than 0.0001. You can see that kind of over here in this thing. That's bad. This is the one time in research, I mean, not the only time, but this is the time in research where a statistically significant value is bad because it means the groups are not random, right? We don't have a control of bias by age, in this case, or by sex, or by mental illness, or any of the other factors that we've included in this model, right? This is the one time where a p-value of 1 is great. We actually want them to be totally statistically random, if possible, along these variables, if at all doable. So we're going to look at before matching. We can see that their p-value is statistically significant, and that's bad. And the standard difference, we want this value ideally to be below 0.1. That's a critical value threshold that you can use as a rule of thumb to assess whether your model is doing well. Well, none of our things are under 0.1. Sorry, this mental illness one, you can wind up with an interesting situation. I'm going to point this out down below, where this difference before matching is statistically significant, and the standard difference is below 0.1. And that goes against everything I just told you a moment ago, right? Well, because that's good, right? Our standard difference is below 0.1. And in fact, we should default to interpret that value if we possibly can, because when you have very large cohorts on the order of 2 million people or more, you can wind up with things being statistically significant, irrespective of their actual scale. So even though this p-value is under 0.05, that's great. That's bad in this case. The actual difference between the two groups is still quite low, right? So that's actually worth noting here. It's below our critical threshold. And what you'll see is after matching, even though the percentages of the groups are much closer to each other after matching, like they go down from 5.6 versus 4.8 to 4 to 4.8 right here, we still were unable to get to a statistically non-significant difference between the two groups, but the value is below zero point 0.1. So this is actually still a good characteristic. It's something that is a little confusing, but remember, standard difference below zero point 0.1 is good. Again, here's that p-value. After matching, you'll see that of the 168,795 people selected from these cohorts, the average age is now 66.8 plus or minus 11.8, which is basically, you know, there's no difference between the two by age, right? They're no longer statistically significantly different, which means the likelihood that age, that difference of 14 years ish is going to factor into our analysis drops, right? And you can see here that our p-value is 1.0, which is kind of completely random, right? And our standard difference is way less than zero point 0.1. It's like 0.000001. It's like one, what, 10,000, 1,000th. Um, so we're really below that critical value. So that means that our propensity score match is actually doing its job, right? It's helping to make sure that there are no differences, no statistically significant differences between the ages or the sex representation of the two groups before and after matching. There we go again. Um, And you'll see that that's kind of what's going on here. You can see a lot more of the characteristics, whether they're racial, by race, by here are the values I was telling you earlier. You can see that before matching are people in the range of 3.5 to 5.7. It was higher in cohort one versus cohort two. And after matching, there's no statistical difference between the two groups. And we can safely say that the potential bias of having a bunch of people with healthy blood sugar in one group is unlikely to impact our study. Same with all of the different layers of that group. I tend to not bother with this top level because um, it's not stratified categorically the way that the rest of our analyses are. Same here with BMI, that are healthy, um, low obesity, and high obesity group are not statistically significantly different before matching, and after matching, they are. Sorry. They are statistically significantly different before matching, meaning that there is a difference in rates of these different components before matching. After matching, they are not statistically significantly different, which means that the distribution of these factors is should ideally be non-biased. So um, again, I actually, this is something I want to call your attention to. I'm going to flip back over here. Please note that unchecking the characteristics on the propensity score matching input screen does not remove them from your analysis. It just removes them from this simulation. You have to go back. So uncheck, I see this all the time. Please listen. Unchecking these boxes here does nothing to change your propensity score matching characteristics. Those are derived from these saved characteristics way back under your characteristics tab. You have to go back here and uncheck them from here to remove them from your analysis. So I just wanted to, that's an interface quirk that I see people all the time. I'll be like, okay, well, did you remove, what's in your propensity score model? And they take me to their balanced cohort function. They show me, oh, I unchecked it. It's not included. And then I have to show them that, yes, it is included because you have to unstar them from that previous screen that we talked about a moment ago. This does nothing. Don't do that. Okay, well, okay, you might say, all right, thanks, cool. Maybe I'll use that, maybe I won't. I don't have to propensity score match anything. I'm not going to learn this skill right now. Well, how does propensity score matching impact your results? Well, it can have an enormous impact, right? Because the specter of bias, the possibility of biases in your study, can radically shift your results. So let's look at this. Without propensity score matching, your this study where we looked at Alzheimer's disease and statins, it would look like if you looked at the risk percentages in the group and the statistical values that come out of this, that being on a statin makes you almost twice as likely as not being on a statin to develop Alzheimer's disease during the study period, right? Your risk ratio is 5.34. It's a very robust 95% confidence interval. Um, and your risk percentages are much higher, even though these are relatively small folks in the cohort. As an overall percentage of the cohort, they are pretty sizable. So that's that would seem to confirm our German friend from my clownery Instagram clownery example that he is correct. Statins are causing Alzheimer's. Well, we can't really claim causality, but they are associated with higher risks of Alzheimer's. Well, no, actually, what's happening is we're just seeing that older people who have more comorbidities are sicker and wind up developing Alzheimer's at higher rates than people who don't have those factors. And we know that because when we propensity score match very carefully, the way we did in my study, everything flips, right? All of a sudden, the people in the no statins group who are where differences in age have been nullified by random choices of these folks by random age distribution, or rather, the age distribution is not statistically significantly different. That gender distribution is not statistically significantly different. Um, those folks are in the statins group are actually much less likely to wind up getting Alzheimer's. The statins group folks are 1.5 times more likely than the statins group, right? So if you don't propensity score match, you will be getting potentially very faulty outcomes from these large scale cohorts. I just want to be clear that it's not the only way that we control for bias in these studies, but it is a very good way. So you can see also that TriNetX was able to find 167,000 people from both cohorts ish. One thing worth noting is when you propensity score match, we'll talk about this next time. When you exclude outcomes from prior to the window, it can wind up excluding people from your study, and you can wind up with slightly fewer people than you might expect in there. We'll talk more about that in the outcomes analysis next time. So what are some other ways to control for error? Well, propensity score matching does a good job of equalizing the study and preserving your power. But other ways you can, take the burden off of your propensity score model, take the burden off of you to figure out these models and get them accurate one way you could do it is to shrink the age of your study, right? To be more specific rather than just everybody over the age of 18. Pick groups of people that are more focused, right, in the actual age brackets you're interested in. And if we did that, which we did wind up doing, we'd lose some of our early onset cases, but we'd preserve more power in our study. You can subdivide groups and look at them separately. So it might be that the differences between men and women in outcomes radically change your findings. So dividing women and men into separate groups for separate comparisons may be worthwhile. Might be worth comparing men with statins versus men with statins to see whether there are different outcomes. And remove your confounders. Maybe it's better to remove some of the other characteristics that are in our model that might be muddying up our signal. So propensity score matching is a great way to do things, but it is not a way to make up for a poorly designed cohort. All right. A couple of quick common questions and errors in propensity score matching. Thank you for your patience. We're coming now towards the end of our night. Again, to revisit this, do not add top level codes. Selecting top level codes from, like, for example, G00 to G99, which is diseases of the nervous system, can make your analysis less accurate because TriNetX will grab people with any of those characteristics underneath, and that can really actually be counterproductive to your propensity score matching approach. And that includes everything, again, from cerebral palsy to Alzheimer's disease to Parkinson's to Lou Gehrig's to all sorts of things in there that may ALS, which may be MS, that may be completely unrelated to the question that you're asking clinically. So don't pick those top level codes really for any reason. Again, so following on that, strongly suggest that you select codes at the right level. So E00 to E99 includes hyperlipidemia, but type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes and a whole range of other endocrine disorders. So selecting that top level is not wise, but this is one that's interesting. Selecting E08 to E13, which is diabetes mellitus here, is problematic as well because type 1 and type 2 diabetes are completely different diseases. One is a type 1 diabetes is essentially an autoimmune disorder, right? Where your cells, your immune system attacks your pancreas and kills the cells that produce insulin, right? Whereas type 2 diabetes is a cardiometabolic disorder that where your body becomes overly or underly sensitive to insulin, right? And you wind up with a runaway mechanism where your body is basically constantly starved of glucose because it's locking it away in your cells. That's my like fourth grade explanation. As I say, hashtag not that kind of doctor. I probably didn't get that right. But radically different diseases with different progressions, different times of life, different ages, all sorts of stuff that's very, very, very different between these two groups. So selecting that top list. Sometimes people are like, oh, yeah, well, I just included type 1 and type 2 just to be on the safe side. No, you're actually messing yourself up when you do that. Selecting the characteristics because of their relationship to your outcomes and your understanding of clinical practice and physiology is going to be essential. Now, as students, many of you out there are going to be developing your knowledge of these relationships, and that's fine. You're going to come up with some nonsense in the beginning, but making sure that you always check this over with a clinical mentor and with a mentor who has some expertise in real world data and large scale data analysis, whether it's me or somebody at another institution or whatever. You always want to do that to make sure that you're not junking up the literature and the research with poorly designed studies that do things like propensity score match for type 1 and type 2 diabetes, unless there's some theoretical reason to do that. So select codes at the right level, do it conscientiously. Um, okay. Using the signal icon mindlessly. I do frequently talk to students. You can see over here that, oh, this is, this 3% difference between these two cohorts. That's why I selected it. Just TriNetX told me to do this, right? They're weighted, meaning that they can show high levels of difference between otherwise relatively similar groups. So they can be very helpful, but you really need to think about like, does encounter for supervision of normal pregnancy relate to my analysis in of statins and Alzheimer's? Well, not really. Two completely different times of life. Probably, I mean, unless you have some reason to believe that pregnancy wards off Alzheimer's or impacts it in some way, based on some existing research or theory that you have, there's no reason that you should be selecting these things willy-nilly just because TriNetX tells you to. I can often see this when I see people have like 80 characteristics in their saved characteristics, and that would indicate to me that they haven't really given it sufficient thought, right? Not that there's a correct number of characteristics to have in your study. Um, there's not one like more is good or less is good or whatever, but you do want to adhere to the law of parsimony, right? You want to have as few as you need to have make sure you're controlling the bias in your study. Okay, final note on this. While some studies include them, I do not recommend propensity score matching again for under the demographics characteristics, current age, unknown sex, not Hispanic or Latino, unknown ethnicity, unknown race, other race. And I recommend using these diagnostic categories of R0 to R99, symptom, signs, and abnormal clinical laboratory findings very carefully because people are sometimes like, well, I want to control whether they have a cough. Well, yeah, they might have had a cough at any time for any reason, and that got entered into their record. You want to make sure that you're very clear about why and when and how coughs occur. And those would fall under like R00 to R99. Z00 to Z99 are factors influencing health status and contact with health services. Um, there are so many different factors in there. Selecting them willy-nilly is not great. And also, these Z codes are not uniformly used across the United States. So they are can be potentially um, loaded based on the geographic or health system that is using them versus ones that are not. So it's something important to think about. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention on so far. I know I've been doing a lot of talking, but we're here now at the end with our practice problem. I want to revisit what we talked about last week, where we talked about creating cohorts for the following scenarios. We want to talk about, and please put some questions or thoughts in the chat, or we'll go through this in a second. We can reconvene to that. The first practice problem was last week. We expanded from our initial analysis of creating a cohort of women between the ages of 18 to 45, but we wanted to specify that this time that the diagnosis of fibroids occurred before a laparoscopic surgery. So I'm going to go back here and try to find that really quick. Uh, okay, yeah, here we go. So we talked about last time 18 to 45-year-old women. And what we're going to do, this builds on our last week's discussion, where we are going to add a related group. And what we want to do is then specify that I believe it was let me just check that really quick. The fibroids occurred before the laparoscopic surgery, or at least in relationship to them. So what we're going to call this, to make this easier, we're going to call this fibroids. And then over here, we're going to call this surgery. And we're going to use this function to say that we're looking for people who, on the same day as, or, you could also say, generally it's good to say like, the following day, because they might be diagnosed in one visit and then come back later. And versus some health systems, the person might show up that day, they're diagnosed that day because they're showing up for the surgery, right? So that can impact whether you want to choose same day or one day after. We're going to say up to 1 month following that. So if we save this, we're going to find out that any instance of surgery occurred within 1 day and 1 month after any instance of fibroids. So that's kind of your solution to our practice problem on this one last week. And hit the count patients on that just to see. And we're going to go back and take a look quickly at our diagnoses, labs, and medications. So we're going to create a cohort of type 2 diabetics with a BMI over 30. And now we're going to specify that they were treated with 5 milligrams of semaglutide, but never received metformin or SGLT2Is before the GLP. So we're going to specify that they had these diagnoses and that we're going to go to add related group again, just like we did in the previous one. And we're going to add all of these guys into this characteristic. And we're going to say that they had never previously, in the prior time, had any of these characteristics. So we're going to say TTDM plus BMI over 30. And this is GLP-1. So any instance of GLP-1 occurred at least, sorry, wait, okay, gotcha. They were treated with 5 milligrams of semaglutide after the watch. So we're going to go projecting forward again and say that after they were diagnosed with that, they got their first example or first semaglutide prescription, but no metformin or SGLT2. These people went straight for semaglutide rather than metformin. Okay, so those are the solutions from our problems from last week. Hopefully, you've got something similar. And that's all I got to say. You can put questions in here. I'm going to turn off the thing in just the recording in just a second so we can talk. But next week, we will be talking about conducting our outcomes analysis. We will be sharing some of those tricks and tips for how to get accurate analyses. And I think we will show you some of the cool stuff that you can learn statistically in TriNetX. So I'm going to stop the recording right now.